All right, welcome to this explainer on Module 6. Today, we're tackling something you probably see in the news and feel in your wallet literally every single day: inflation. But we aren't just going to look at rising prices and leave it at that. We're going to really pop the hood and dive deep into the mechanics, the hidden causes, the actual costs, and the sometimes brutal cures of this economic condition. Whether you're just tracking your own grocery bills or deep into macroeconomic theory, this is absolutely foundational stuff. Let's get into it. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll cover defining and measuring inflation, demand pull versus cost push, expected versus unexpected inflation, the social cost of inflation, the extremes of hyperinflation, and finally, anti-inflationary policies. Kicking things off with Section 1, defining and measuring inflation. Okay, so the crucial point I want to make right out of the gate is that inflation isn't just about one expensive item. Like, if the price of your favorite cold brew coffee jumps up because of a bad harvest in Brazil, well, that's a bummer, but it's not necessarily inflation. True inflation is a systemic increase in the overall price level across the entire economy. Basically, it means the purchasing power of your money has fundamentally shrunk. Every dollar you hold literally just buys less than it did yesterday. And this perfectly illustrates what we call the classical dichotomy. This is a theoretical foundation showing that, in the long run, the money supply determines nominal variables, like price levels, but it completely leaves real economic variables alone. Think of it like this. If a central bank suddenly doubles the money supply, eventually the numbers on the price tags are going to double too. That's the nominal side. But doubling the money supply doesn't magically build more factories, it doesn't harvest more wheat, and it doesn't train more workers. Those are real variables. So in classical theory, money is neutral in the long run. It just changes the yardstick we use to measure value, not the actual physical output of the whole shebang. Moving right along to Section 2, demand pull versus cost push. Now that we know what it is, we gotta ask, why is it happening? It's vital to compartmentalize the two distinct drivers here. You have to ask yourself, are prices rising because consumers are demanding too much, or because a shock has made it too expensive for producers to actually supply the goods? Demand pull inflation happens when you basically have too much money chasing too few goods. Imagine a booming economy, right? Everyone has jobs, everyone wants to spend, but the factories simply can't pump out items fast enough. On the flip side, cost push inflation is driven by a sudden shock to the supply side. Think of a massive, abrupt spike in global oil prices. That pushes production costs way up, and guess what? Those costs are passed directly onto you, the consumer. Now, what's really fascinating here is the massive dilemma policymakers face, and you can see it visually captured by the Phillips curve. It shows this distinct short-run trade-off. An economy might actually accept higher inflation just to achieve lower unemployment, a dynamic we often link to those demand pull forces we were just talking about. So if a government stimulates aggregate demand to create jobs, yeah, they push unemployment down, but they inevitably push inflation right up. It is a total macroeconomic tightrope walk.
All right, Section 3, expected versus unexpected inflation.
Before I just give you the answer, I want you to really think about this. How does a surprise jump in prices affect different people in an economy? Think about someone keeping their life savings in cash under a mattress versus someone who just took out a massive fixed-rate mortgage to buy a house. Who wins that scenario and who loses? Well, the pain you feel depends heavily on whether you saw the inflation coming. If it's expected inflation, it's mostly just a headache. We get what economists call shoe leather costs, which is literally the time and effort of running to the bank to manage your cash more often to avoid losing value, and menu costs, the physical cost for a business to constantly print new price lists. Annoying for sure. But unexpected inflation, that is much more dangerous. It arbitrarily redistributes wealth. It absolutely crushes lenders because they get paid back in a currency that buys way less than when they loaned it out. But here's the wild part. It actually helps borrowers. If you have a massive fixed debt, unexpected inflation means you get to pay off that debt with cheaper, wimpier dollars. Let's move into Section 4, social costs of inflation. Inflation goes way beyond just wincing at higher prices at the grocery store. Persistent inflation acts like sand in the gears of the entire economic engine. First off, it completely distorts money's main job as a reliable measure of value, which makes long-term business planning virtually impossible. Second, you have the Fisher effect. This is a critical concept showing that as inflation rises, nominal interest rates have to rise one for one to compensate, just so lenders can break even. And third, this one really stings. It creates unintended tax liabilities. You might sell an asset for profit on paper, but after factoring in inflation, you actually lost purchasing power. Yet the government, they're still going to tax you on those phantom capital gains. No way around it.
During hyperinflations, most of the costs of inflation become severe. That's a direct quote from our macro texts, and man, does it set the stage. Because what happens when this standard rules just completely break down?
Which brings us to Section 5, the extremes of hyperinflation.
Listen, hyperinflation isn't just high inflation. It is an entirely different beast. We are talking about prices doubling every month, every week, or sometimes literally every day. And it's almost exclusively driven by a government's desperate need to print money to fund itself when it can no longer raise taxes or borrow money normally. Let's walk through how this nightmare cycle actually plays out step by step. First, a government runs a massive budget deficit. Second, since nobody wants to buy its debt, it resorts to the printing press to finance the deficit. We call this seigniorage, and it's basically a stealth inflation tax on anyone holding the currency. Third, as they print more to cover those rising costs, the money supply expands exponentially. And finally, the value of the currency completely collapses, sending prices skyrocketing into the stratosphere, which means the government has to print even more money to afford anything. It is a devastating, endless loop. And we've seen this happen. History gives us some stark, terrifying warnings. Take interwar Germany. The government was crushed by massive war reparations and responded with catastrophic money printing. People were literally burning stacks of cash just to stay warm because it was cheaper than buying wood. Or look at Zimbabwe more recently, where an economic collapse paired with massive deficit financing resulted in astronomical hyperinflation. So what's the cure? Well, in both cases, the madness only stopped with drastic, highly credible fiscal reforms that permanently eliminated the government's need for seigniorage. Basically, you have to rip the plug out of the printing press entirely. And that leads us to our final section, Section 6, Anti-Inflationary Policies. Getting inflation back to baseline requires a highly coordinated two-pronged attack. First, the government has to fix its budget to restore confidence. Second, and this is the big one, the central bank has to step in and choke off the growth of the money supply, usually by jacking up interest rates. This inevitably cools down aggregate demand. People stop borrowing as much, businesses hit pause on expanding, and as a result, unemployment temporarily rises. But it's exactly this cooling process that finally forces those long-term inflation expectations to adjust downward, stabilizing prices across the board. So, here is the harsh reality. The cure is almost always painful. To wring inflation out of the system, society has to endure what economists call the sacrifice ratio. This metric represents the lost output, literally the percentage of a year's real GDP that just vanishes in order to reduce inflation by a single percentage point. We are talking about lost revenue, closed businesses, and lost jobs. It is the very sobering price tag of achieving price stability. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one of macroeconomics' greatest unresolved debates. When an economy runs too hot and that inflation fever really takes hold, we absolutely know how to cure it. But when a central bank deliberately induces a recession, forces businesses to shut their doors, and puts people out of work just to stabilize prices, is the resulting pain of that sacrifice ratio truly worth the cure? It's a heavy question, and it's one every single generation of policymakers has to answer for themselves. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the data in front of you.